An arrogant judge laughs at a black teenager in court, but when she starts quoting laws better than the lawyers, his smug smile disappears. What happens next will leave the entire courtroom in shock. The heavy wooden gavel slammed against the judge's desk, sending a sharp echo through the packed courtroom. The air was thick with tension. At the center of it all stood 18-year-old Harper Ellis, her dark eyes steady, her shoulders squared, refusing to let the weight of the moment crush her. She had been in difficult situations before, but nothing like this. Judge Randolph Hathaway peered down at her from his towering bench, a smirk playing on his thin lips. He was well known in Lincoln County for his harsh sentences and complete lack of patience for young offenders, especially those who came from backgrounds he deemed undesirable. "Miss Ellis," he drawled, his voice laced with condescension. "I assume you understand the seriousness of the charges against you?" Harper remained silent, holding his gaze. She knew this game. The moment she spoke, he would twist her words, mock her intelligence, and make an example of her. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stood and adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught near the scene of the crime. We have surveillance footage placing her there. The evidence is overwhelming." Harper clenched her fists. She knew that footage wouldn't show her stealing anything. But she also knew how the system worked. Judge Hathaway chuckled. "Overwhelming, indeed. And yet, I suppose you'll stand there and claim you're just an innocent bystander, won't you?" The way he spoke to her, like she was beneath him, like she was stupid, made something burn inside her. But she kept her face unreadable. "Do you have a lawyer, Miss Ellis?" Hathaway asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or are we supposed to pretend you understand how this works?" The courtroom chuckled, quietly, but loud enough for her to hear. Harper took a deep breath. The time had come. "I'll be representing myself," she said firmly. The room went dead silent. Even the prosecutor's mouth twitched in surprise. Hathaway blinked, then let out an amused scoff. "You?" He leaned forward. "You think you can take on an actual prosecutor in a real courtroom? This isn't some TV show, sweetheart." Harper didn't flinch. She had expected this reaction. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "I know my rights. And I know the law. I have the right to represent myself, and I intend to exercise that right." Hathaway's smirk faltered for just a second before he quickly masked it. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I strongly advise against this. The defendant doesn't have the necessary legal training." "She made her choice," Hathaway interrupted, still eyeing Harper. His smile returned, but this time, it carried something darker. "Let's proceed. This should be very entertaining." Harper exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She knew the odds were stacked against her. But what the judge and the prosecutor didn't know. She wasn't just any defendant. She was about to turn this courtroom upside down. The courtroom was still buzzing from Harper's declaration. She could feel the weight of dozens of skeptical eyes on her, but she kept her head high. She had spent years preparing for a moment like this, even if she never expected it to come in such a personal and high-stakes way. Judge Hathaway leaned back in his chair, his expression filled with amusement. "Very well," he said, tapping his fingers on the desk. "Since you seem so eager to play lawyer, let's see if you actually know what you're doing." Harper didn't react to his taunts. Instead, she turned to the prosecutor, who was already shuffling his notes, clearly preparing to dismantle her case as quickly as possible. "As the prosecution has claimed," Harper said, her voice steady, "there is surveillance footage placing me near the scene of the alleged crime. I'd like to request that this footage be presented immediately." The prosecutor looked at Judge Hathaway, expecting him to dismiss her request. Instead, the judge smirked. "Why not? Let's humor her." He nodded toward the clerk, who queued up the footage on the courtroom's monitor. Harper had already seen it. It showed her walking past the store where the robbery occurred, nothing more. But she knew how the system worked, how they used circumstantial evidence against people like her. As the grainy black and white footage played, the prosecutor stood. "There," he said, pausing the video at the moment Harper was near the entrance. "This places the defendant at the scene just minutes before the robbery. Given the time frame and the lack of any other suspects, it's clear that—" "Objection," Harper interrupted. Her voice was calm, but firm. The prosecutor blinked. The judge raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Hathaway asked, clearly entertained by the idea of her playing lawyer. Harper stepped forward. "Speculation. The footage does not show me committing a crime, nor does it show any evidence that I was involved. It simply shows me walking by. If we're going to start arresting people based on where they happen to be, then half the city should be in this courtroom." A low murmur spread through the room. Even some of the jury members exchanged glances. The prosecutor's lips tightened. "Miss Ellis," he said, his tone suddenly colder, "while the footage itself does not directly show you stealing, it is part of a larger body of evidence. Witnesses saw someone matching your description running from the store." Harper tilted her head. "Witnesses?" The prosecutor flipped through his files. "A store clerk, Robert Kinley, identified you from a police lineup." Harper nodded as if considering this carefully. "And when exactly did this identification take place?" The prosecutor hesitated. 2 days after the robbery." 2 days, Harper repeated, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we both know that witness memory becomes increasingly unreliable over time. The human brain doesn't work like a video recorder. It distorts and fills in gaps. Science supports this. So I asked the prosecution, was Mr. Kinley shown other individuals before he identified me?" The prosecutor hesitated just a little too long before answering. "He was given a lineup," he finally said, his voice quieter now. "A lineup where I was the only one who even remotely matched the description, I assume?" Harper asked, arching an eyebrow. Silence. The murmuring in the courtroom grew louder. Judge Hathaway shifted in his seat, narrowing his eyes. For the first time, Harper saw something flicker in them, something that almost looked like concern. She wasn't just some scared teenager trying to talk her way out of trouble. She actually knew what she was doing. Judge Hathaway tapped his gavel. "Enough," he said, his usual smugness not quite as strong anymore. "Miss Ellis, I hope you're not under the impression that a few well-phrased arguments will get you out of this." Harper turned to him, meeting his gaze with unwavering confidence. "No, Your Honor," she said. "But I do expect the law to be followed. And right now, it seems like the only thing linking me to this crime is assumption and flawed procedure." Hathaway's jaw tensed. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in his own courtroom. Harper knew she had only scratched the surface. There was more to uncover, and she was just getting started. The silence in the courtroom was thick with tension. Harper could feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on her, but she refused to let it shake her. She had come too far to let intimidation win. Judge Hathaway stared at her, his smug expression faltering ever so slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a teenager. But there was something about Harper Ellis that he couldn't ignore. She wasn't stumbling through this like a desperate defendant grasping at straws. She was methodical, composed. It was unsettling. "Very well," the judge said, clearing his throat. "Miss Ellis, if you want to keep up this little act, be my guest. But I assure you, the prosecution has more than enough to bury you." Harper didn't flinch. "Then let's hear it," she said. The prosecutor stood, visibly irritated. He had underestimated her, and now he was scrambling to regain control. He picked up a folder and flipped through the pages with exaggerated confidence. "The defendant claims the video footage is circumstantial," he said, glancing at the jury. She argues that witness memory is unreliable. Fine. Let's move on to something much more concrete. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, we have physical evidence that links the defendant to the crime. Harper's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. She already had an idea of what was coming. The prosecutor held up a clear plastic evidence bag containing a small silver bracelet. This bracelet was found at the scene of the crime, he announced. It was recovered behind the store, near the emergency exit used by the suspect to flee. And it just so happens to have Miss Ellis's fingerprints on it. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Hathaway leaned forward, intrigued. Now that is interesting, he said, looking down at Harper with renewed satisfaction. What do you have to say about that, Miss Ellis? Harper exhaled slowly. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment they thought would break her. She stepped forward. May I examine the evidence? The judge exchanged a glance with the prosecutor, who hesitated before reluctantly nodding. The bailiff brought the plastic bag over to Harper, allowing her to see it up close. She immediately recognized the bracelet. It was hers. But that didn't mean it proved anything. Harper turned to face the jury, her voice calm but firm. Yes, this is my bracelet. But let's consider some facts before jumping to conclusions. She held it up. First, there is no proof of when this bracelet was left behind. Fingerprints can last for days, even weeks, under the right conditions. The prosecution has no way of proving that it was dropped during the robbery and not before or after. She saw the prosecutor shift uncomfortably. She had found the first crack. Second, she continued, where exactly was this bracelet found? She turned to the prosecutor. You said it was near the emergency exit? The prosecutor nodded. Correct. Harper's eyes sharpened. Then I'd like to introduce a key piece of information, one that you conveniently failed to mention. She took a deep breath before delivering the final blow. I've never been behind that store before. The prosecutor scoffed. That's convenient. Harper turned to the jury, addressing them directly. It is convenient, isn't it? So let's think critically for a moment. If I had never been behind the store, how could my bracelet have ended up there? The only logical explanation is that someone else put it there. Someone who wanted it to be found. A ripple of whispers ran through the courtroom. Harper could see the uncertainty in the jury's eyes now. Judge Hathaway's smirk was gone. His fingers tapped against the bench, his mind working quickly. Miss Ellis, you're accusing someone of planting evidence? Harper met his gaze without hesitation. I'm saying it's a very real possibility, Your Honor. A possibility that should be properly investigated instead of being brushed aside for the sake of an easy conviction. The judge studied her for a long moment, then turned to the prosecutor. What do you say to that? The prosecutor was clearly caught off guard. He scrambled for a response. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. But does it? Harper interjected. Because so far, we have assumptions, unreliable witness testimony, and now evidence that may have been planted. If the prosecution wants to argue facts, then I demand they provide some that actually hold up under scrutiny. The room went completely silent. Even Judge Hathaway seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice lower now. Miss Ellis, where exactly did you learn to argue like this? Harper held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She wasn't ready to reveal that just yet. Let's just say, she said evenly, I know more than you think. The tension in the courtroom had shifted. Harper could feel it. Before, the weight of the trial had been pressing solely on her, but now, it was pressing on the prosecution as well. The cracks in their case had begun to show, and for the first time, Judge Hathaway wasn't smirking. He was studying her, as if trying to figure out who, exactly, he was dealing with. The prosecutor, however, wasn't ready to back down. He tightened his grip on his folder, his face unreadable, but Harper could see the frustration in his eyes. She had just dismantled their key piece of physical evidence, and he needed to regain control. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat. "The defense is throwing around accusations without proof. She wants us to believe that her bracelet was planted, but she has no evidence to support that claim. And yet, we do have evidence that places her at the scene of the crime. Witnesses. Video footage. Physical proof." Harper crossed her arms. "Physical proof that has not been properly examined," she countered. "Your Honor, I request that the fingerprint analysis report be submitted to the court." The prosecutor's jaw tightened. Judge Hathaway raised an eyebrow. "Prosecution, do you have that report available?" There was a long pause before the prosecutor hesitated and glanced at the bailiff. "We do, Your Honor. But I fail to see how." "Then let's see it," Hathaway said sharply. "If you're so confident in your case, there shouldn't be an issue, correct?" The prosecutor hesitated for only a second before nodding stiffly. The bailiff retrieved a file from the evidence table and handed it to the judge. Harper watched closely as Hathaway skimmed through the pages. And then, she saw it. His expression changed, just slightly, but enough. His lips pressed together. His fingers drummed against the desk. Harper took a step forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to request permission to see that report as well." Hathaway's eyes flicked up to her, and for the first time, there was no amusement in them. He was studying her now, not as a foolish defendant, but as something else entirely. After a long pause, he handed the report to the bailiff, who brought it to Harper. She scanned the document quickly, her pulse accelerating. "There it is." She lifted her eyes to the jury. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "this report states that my fingerprints were found on the bracelet. However," she turned to the prosecutor, "would you care to explain why the report also states that there were two different sets of fingerprints on it?" A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face darkened. That is irrelevant." "Objection," Harper cut in. "It is very relevant. The prosecution made it seem as though this bracelet was definitive proof of my involvement. But they deliberately left out a key fact: someone else's fingerprints were found on it as well. Which means the question isn't just whether or not I touched my own bracelet, it's who else did and why." Judge Hathaway turned back to the prosecutor. "Prosecution, is this true?" The prosecutor hesitated. "Your Honor, while it is technically true that another set of prints were found, they were inconclusive." Harper smirked. "Inconclusive? Or inconvenient?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs again. Even some of the jury members were nodding along now. Judge Hathaway slammed his gavel. "Enough. Prosecution, you will explain why this detail was not included in your initial argument." The prosecutor's mouth pressed into a thin line. He knew he had lost control of the narrative, and Harper could see it. She turned back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I was accused based on circumstantial evidence. The prosecution conveniently ignored unreliable witness memory, dismissed the possibility of planted evidence, and now they've been caught withholding key details about the fingerprint analysis." She paused for effect, then delivered her final blow. "If they're so certain I'm guilty, why are they working so hard to twist the truth?" Silence. Pure, heavy silence. Judge Hathaway exhaled slowly, his fingers steepled together as he stared down at Harper. "Miss Ellis," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "Who are you?" Harper tilted her head slightly. "I'm someone who knows the law," she said simply. Hathaway didn't respond. He just kept watching her, and she could tell, he wasn't just seeing a defendant anymore. He was seeing something more. And he didn't like it. Not one bit. The courtroom was no longer just a stage for Harper's defense, it had become a battlefield. And right now, the prosecution was losing. Harper could feel it in the way the jury shifted in their seats, their eyes darting toward the prosecutor with growing doubt. She could hear it in the low murmurs sweeping across the room, the subtle change in energy that signaled a shift in control. But she wasn't done yet. Judge Hathaway's fingers tapped against the bench as he studied her. "Miss Ellis," he said slowly, "you seem to know quite a bit about legal proceedings for someone who, until today, was just a defendant standing trial." His sharp gaze locked onto hers. "Why is that?" Harper held his stare. She could tell he was trying to unnerve her, but she wasn't about to let him. "I study the law, Your Honor," she answered, her voice unwavering. Hathaway raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And where exactly did you study it?" Harper hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She could tell the judge was testing her, waiting for her to slip. "Everywhere I could," she said finally. "I learned from books, from case studies, from analyzing real trials like this one. I studied because I knew one day I might need to defend myself. And today, that day came." Hathaway didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the desk. The prosecutor, however, wasn't ready to let this go. "Your Honor," he interjected, clearly seizing the moment to regain control. "This is all very dramatic, but at the end of the day, this case isn't about how well the defendant can argue. It's about facts. And the fact remains, Miss Ellis was at the scene of the crime. Her bracelet was found there. Witnesses identified her." Harper turned to face him. "And yet," she countered, "your key witness, Robert Kinley, didn't identify me until 2 days later. My bracelet, which you claimed as definitive proof, also had someone else's fingerprints on it. And let's not forget, there's still no actual footage of me committing a crime." She took a step closer to the prosecution's table. "So tell me, counselor, how do you explain that?" The prosecutor's lips thinned, but before he could respond, the courtroom doors suddenly opened. A uniformed officer walked in, heading straight for the prosecution's table. He whispered something to the prosecutor, and Harper didn't miss the way the man's face paled slightly. Harper narrowed her eyes. Something just changed. Judge Hathaway noticed too. "What's going on?" he demanded. The prosecutor hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice strained, "it appears, new evidence has come to light." The courtroom buzzed again. Harper's pulse quickened. "What kind of evidence?" Hathaway asked. The officer handed a file to the prosecutor, who hesitated before finally passing it to the judge. Harper watched as Hathaway flipped it open, his eyes scanning the contents. Then, for the first time since the trial began, his expression darkened. The entire room went silent as he slowly looked up. "Prosecution," he said, his voice sharp, "would you care to explain why there is footage, clear footage, of another individual committing the crime in question?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. Harper's heart pounded. They had footage? The prosecutor looked panicked now. "Your Honor, we weren't aware of this evidence until just now." Hathaway's eyes burned into him. "You mean to tell me that law enforcement had access to security footage that showed a completely different suspect, and yet this court was led to believe that Miss Ellis was our only viable perpetrator?" Harper felt her hands tremble slightly, but she forced herself to stay still. She had fought with everything she had, but she never expected something like this to fall into her lap. The judge exhaled through his nose. "Play the footage," he ordered. A moment later, the screen flickered on. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the video played. A figure, wearing dark clothes and a hood, entered the store, moving quickly and deliberately. And then, as the person turned toward the camera for a brief second, the entire case unraveled in an instant. Because it wasn't Harper. It wasn't even someone who looked like her. It was a completely different person. The jury gasped. The prosecutor closed his eyes briefly, knowing it was over. Judge Hathaway slowly turned toward Harper. "It appears," he said, his voice unreadable, "that you were telling the truth all along." Harper exhaled, her body finally releasing the tension it had been holding. She had won. But she wasn't done yet. She lifted her chin. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm, "I would like to know why this evidence was withheld in the first place. Because if it had been brought forward from the start, I never should have been arrested at all." Hathaway's gaze lingered on her. Then, very slowly, he nodded. And Harper knew, this case wasn't just about proving her innocence anymore. It was about exposing the truth. The courtroom had transformed from a battleground to a war zone. The moment the footage played, the entire case against Harper collapsed like a house of cards. But instead of relief, all she felt was anger. Because this never should have happened in the first place. Judge Hathaway's expression remained unreadable, but the tension in his posture was impossible to miss. He tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind clearly racing as he processed what had just been revealed. The jury was still in shock, whispering among themselves. The prosecutor, on the other hand, looked like he had been punched in the gut. Harper took a deep breath. She wasn't done yet. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "I want answers." Hathaway's sharp eyes snapped to her. "Excuse me." She took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "That footage clearly proves that I had nothing to do with this crime. But instead of being treated as innocent until proven guilty, I was arrested, accused, and put on trial based on weak, circumstantial evidence. And now we find out that law enforcement had this footage the entire time." The courtroom buzzed again. Hathaway exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Miss Ellis, I understand your frustration." "No, Your Honor," Harper interrupted. "With all due respect, you don't understand. If I hadn't decided to defend myself, I could have been convicted of a crime I didn't commit. I could have lost my future. My life. And for what? Because someone didn't bother to look at all the evidence." She turned to the prosecutor. "Or because someone chose to ignore it." The prosecutor's face hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Ellis." "So is wrongful prosecution," she shot back. A tense silence filled the room. The judge studied her carefully before turning his attention to the prosecution. "I'd like to hear an explanation as well," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Why wasn't this footage reviewed before trial?" The prosecutor hesitated, his face pale. "Your Honor, I was not made aware of this footage until today. If I had known." Harper's stomach twisted. He was lying. She could see it. But before she could speak, a new voice cut through the silence. "That's not true." Everyone turned as the officer who had delivered the footage stepped forward. His expression was tense, his jaw tight. "The footage was logged into evidence the day of the arrest," he continued. "It was flagged for review. There's no way the prosecution didn't know about it." The room exploded into chaos. Harper's breath caught in her throat as gasps and whispers spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face drained of color, and for the first time since the trial began, Harper saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Panic. Judge Hathaway slammed his gavel. "Order," he barked. The noise died down, but the damage had already been done. The jury was staring at the prosecution in disbelief. The courtroom audience was whispering furiously. And Harper? She felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just incompetence. It was corruption. She took a step forward. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "if the prosecution knew about this footage and still moved forward with this case, then this isn't just a wrongful arrest. It's a deliberate attempt to convict an innocent person. I request an immediate investigation into prosecutorial misconduct." The prosecutor snapped his head toward her. Now, wait just a minute. But Hathaway held up a hand. His jaw was clenched, his expression cold. I think, he said slowly, that Miss Ellis raises a very valid concern. The prosecutor opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He knew he was trapped. Hathaway turned to the bailiff. Contact the district attorney's office. I want an internal review launched immediately. Harper's heart pounded. She had come here just to prove her innocence. But now, she had just exposed something much bigger. The judge exhaled, turning back to her. For the first time, his expression wasn't condescending. It wasn't even annoyed. It was respectful. Miss Ellis, he said, his voice quieter now, you are free to go. Harper's chest tightened. She had won. But somehow, this didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning. Harper sat in stunned silence, barely able to process the words that had just left Judge Hathaway's mouth. You are free to go. For weeks, she had been fighting, clawing for justice in a system that was designed to crush people like her. And now, in a matter of minutes, the truth had unraveled in front of everyone. She was free. But she wasn't satisfied. The courtroom was still in chaos, murmurs and gasps spreading like wildfire. Reporters in the back scribbled furiously in their notebooks, some even rushing out to break the story. The prosecutor, his face now sheet white, had slumped back in his chair, staring at the table as if he could disappear into it. Harper slowly turned to look at Judge Hathaway. The same man who had mocked her, who had doubted her, was now gazing at her with something she never thought she'd see in his eyes. Respect. Miss Ellis, Hathaway said, rubbing his temple as if he were processing everything himself. I will be recommending that your record be cleared immediately. You should never have been here in the first place. Harper felt something inside her unclench, but the fire in her chest still burned. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady. But that's not enough. The murmurs in the courtroom stopped. Hathaway blinked. Excuse me. Harper took a deep breath. I appreciate that my charges are being dropped. But this wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. Someone chose to move forward with this case, even when the evidence proved I was innocent. She turned to face the prosecutor, her gaze sharp. And I want to know why. The prosecutor flinched but quickly masked it with forced indignation. Miss Ellis, you're making serious accusations. Just because evidence was overlooked doesn't mean. Overlooked? Harper let out a sharp laugh. No, this wasn't overlooked. This was buried. And you knew it. The room held its breath. Judge Hathaway leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. Do you have any proof of that claim, Miss Ellis? Harper met his gaze. Not yet. But I will. Hathaway exhaled through his nose, tapping his fingers against the desk. Finally, he turned to the bailiff. Have the district attorney's office send a review team immediately. I want a full audit of this case, including all suppressed evidence and correspondence between the prosecution and law enforcement. His gaze flickered toward the prosecutor, who now looked genuinely nervous. If Miss Ellis is correct, and there was an attempt to manipulate the outcome of this trial, there will be consequences. Harper's heart pounded, but she stood firm. This wasn't just about her anymore. How many others had been put in her position? How many people didn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back? How many had been silenced? Judge Hathaway turned back to her, his expression unreadable. You could have walked out of here today, Miss Ellis. You could have taken your freedom and left this behind. Harper tilted her chin up. And let this happen to someone else? She shook her head. No, Your Honor. That's not who I am. A flicker of something, was it admiration, passed through Hathaway's eyes. Very well, he said. Then let's find out who really belongs in this courtroom. Harper nodded. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something close to victory. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The days after the trial felt surreal. Harper was free, but her mind refused to rest. She had won her case, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. Because it wasn't over. The review ordered by Judge Hathaway had sent shockwaves through the district attorney's office. The investigation uncovered a disturbing pattern. Her case wasn't the only one. Files were missing. Evidence had been manipulated. And worst of all, dozens of convictions had been built on nothing but falsehoods and convenience. The prosecutor who had tried to put her behind bars had resigned in disgrace, facing possible disbarment. But Harper knew he wasn't the only one involved. This went deeper. And she wasn't about to walk away now. 1 week after her trial, Harper sat in a quiet cafe, a notebook open in front of her, filled with scribbled notes and legal references. She had spent years studying law for survival. Now, she was studying it for something else. To change the system. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "You really don't know how to let things go, do you?" Harper looked up to see Judge Hathaway standing across from her table, his expression unreadable. She didn't bother to act surprised. "Should I be flattered that you tracked me down?" she asked, closing her notebook. The judge smirked, shaking his head as he pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You're making a lot of powerful people nervous, Miss Ellis." "It's impressive." Harper leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "If they're nervous, that means I'm doing something right." Hathaway exhaled, studying her for a long moment. "You could have left this behind," he said. "You could have walked away after the trial, started over, gone on with your life." Harper's jaw tightened. "I could have," she admitted. "But if I did, what happens to the next person who gets arrested without cause? What happens to the kid who doesn't know the law like I do? Who gets convicted because they didn't have the chance to fight back?" The judge nodded slowly. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" Harper flipped open her notebook again, pushing it toward him. He glanced down, his eyebrows raising slightly. Legal notes. Case law. Research on wrongful convictions. Plans for appeals. She had been working non-stop since the moment she walked out of that courtroom. "I'm going to law school," she said. "And then I'm coming back to make sure this never happens again." For the first time, Hathaway's expression softened just a little. He closed the notebook and leaned forward, his voice lower now. "You're going to make a lot of enemies, Harper." She smirked. "Good. That means I'm aiming at the right people." Hathaway chuckled, shaking his head. "You really are something else." He stood, sliding the notebook back toward her. "You ever need guidance," he said, "you know where to find me." Harper watched as he walked away, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She had spent the entire trial seeing Hathaway as an enemy. And maybe, in some ways, he still was. But now, he saw her as an equal. Harper picked up her notebook, flipping to the next blank page. There was so much more to do. So much more to fight for. Her battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. This story is more than just a courtroom drama, it's a reflection of the harsh realities of the justice system and the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced by it. Harper Ellis represents the countless individuals who have been wrongfully accused, underestimated, and denied a fair chance simply because of who they are. But what makes her story powerful isn't just her intelligence or her ability to argue in court, it's her refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. She could have walked away after proving her innocence. She could have taken her freedom and tried to forget the nightmare she endured. But true justice isn't just about clearing one name, it's about changing a system that was designed to break people like her. Harper's decision to fight not just for herself but for others speaks to the kind of heroism that often goes unnoticed, the kind that doesn't wear a cape but instead carries the weight of responsibility for those who can't fight for themselves. Judge Hathaway's shift in perspective is also important. He begins as a symbol of the system's arrogance and bias, but by the end, he sees Harper not as just another defendant, but as an equal, perhaps even a future force to be reckoned with. His respect for her isn't just personal, it's an acknowledgement that the system needs people like her to challenge it, to expose its failures, and to demand better. The ending of this story isn't just about victory, it's about purpose. Harper doesn't just win her case, she finds her calling. And in doing so, she becomes something even more powerful than a defendant who beat the odds, she becomes a symbol of change. Her battle is just beginning. And that's what makes her story unforgettable.